when the girl or young woman does not feel understood, and
Yeah.
both sexes leave each other feeling not understood. To badmouth mothers than mothers are to badmouth fathers, a 5-to-1 ratio based on reports
wow.
from reports from the children. So the mother, so the girl looks at the mirror and she sees, half her mother and half her father, but she doesn't feel her mother's a loser. She doesn't feel she doesn't feel abandoned by her mother as much.
Welcome to Growth Minds. Whether it's your first time here or you've been here before, I'm curious to know what it is that brought you here. And if you can, smash that like button below. It really helps spread our message to more people. All right, on to the episode. Yeah, where are you based, by the way?
Just outside of San Francisco. Do you know a place called Mill Valley or Sausalito?
I know Mill Valley. Yep.
Yes, I live in Mill Valley.
Oh, amazing.
And
Very cool.
If you're probably familiar with the redwoods in Mill Valley, and I live in a park, in a redwood park, and so in Mill Valley.
Amazing. And are you mostly now just going around promoting your book? Is that kind of your full endeavor these days? Do you have other things that are keeping you occupied other than spreading the message around the boy crisis and the other books that you have?
Well, my wife, and then in addition, and 2 children. But also, I've just signed 2 new book contracts. One to do a book on couples communication, and another one to, I don't know if you've heard of the myth of male power. Are you familiar with that book?
Myth of Male Power. I might have heard about it just through my research of your books, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe
that's the book that has sort of had the biggest impact, probably. The book that sold the best was Why Men Are the Way They Are, but the book that sort of is considered the Bible of the men's movement, if you will, is The Myth of Male Power, and that's sort of been featured in documentaries and stuff. So they've asked me to do a revision of that book that's 30 years old now, and so I'll be calling it the Paradox of Male Power, to make it a bit more user friendly for women. So that'll be so. But my first job, that I'm working on almost every day now, is a book called Role Mate to Soulmate, which is based on my 30 years of couples communication work that I've been doing.
Amazing. And when's that coming out?
That'll probably come out in late 2023 or 2024.
Okay, so not worth promoting just yet.
Well, the thing for I do have oftentimes when people hear about the couples course, they're often in couples trouble type of thing, and so it's on my if people go to my website, there's a section on couples communication, and in that section there is a video that I've done of the entire course. That's able to be bought, and it's like a fraction of the like $197 versus attending one of my seminars is about $3,000, and seeing me personally is a lot more than that, and so it's a much easier way for people to have access to it.
Yeah, so I'll make sure we link that, and maybe we can talk about it at the end. But
sure.
Why don't we jump in? So I'm fascinated to talk to you just through the research. And I know you've been on other podcasts, but I'm going to start with this statistic, which is that in more than 60 areas this is your statistics, 60 areas in 56 of the largest developed nations, there is higher rates of suicide and mental illness and lower achievement in education, which basically means you're saying the more developed the nations are, the more issues that children, particularly boys, are having in these specific spots, which is fascinating to me because it seems counterintuitive, right? You would figure the better the country does, the more educated the more well off. So where is the disparity here? How is this such a oxymoron that the better you do in a society, that the worse the boys off
Mhm.
are younger boys, and
Yeah.
particularly going into young men?
I really like the way you pointed out that sort of counterintuitive dimension to it. And here's what happens. So the more developed the nation is, the more the nation in the middle and upper middle class can worry less about survival. And so
Mm.
when it worries less about survival, they don't have to have such strict rules that are survival based. So when you're focused on survival, you had to have the, very women raise children, men raise money. The roles had to be very rigid and strict in most cultures, and so the more traditional, the more traditional the culture, oftentimes the more it is a survival-based culture. But as
Right.
survival in the middle and upper middle class begins to not be such a controlling problem, the society can start, working on allowing people freedoms that allow them to be more fulfilled rather than just focused on survival. A little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and so what happens is the men and the women start saying, well, gee, I really feel like I'm in a minimum security prison marriage here. I married this person and but I feel psychologically divorced. Do I really want to live my whole life that way? And the no answer becomes more viable to say, okay, I'll get a divorce. I don't want to live the rest of my life that way. And in the developed nations, there's more freedom to do that. But what happens with boys is that usually translates into the moms becoming the primary parent and the dads often falling out of the parenting process. Oftentimes, the mom falls in love with a new man, and she wants to move to a new location. She wants to have her child or children with her. She feels she's the one primarily responsible for the child, and wants to give him that type of love. But what the boy ends up having is no male role model, except the mother thinks that, oh, the stepfather will be just fine if there's a
Mm.
stepfather involved in the process, or I'll just do fine with that. And we didn't realize that and mothers didn't know this ahead of time, but well, for all the efforts and hard work that the mothers put in, the boy is often feeling like he doesn't have a number of the ingredients that dads tend to bring to parenting. One of those is boundary enforcement. Another one is sort of a bonding that fathers often do with sports or roughhousing or teasing
Sure.
or taking risks and so on. When I did the research for the boy crisis, I discovered that there were at least 9 major differences between dad style parenting and mom style parenting. And the dad style parenting was we often think of moms as having unconditional love. We don't use that term so much with dads, but in fact, dads have unconditional love too. They just have more conditional approval. And so,
Mm.
if the child wants to, become a gymnast, and the mother will usually be very good at saying, "Oh, sweetie, yes, you're so good at gymnastics, or you're so good at whatever it is that you could get into the Olympics, or you could be an NBA star, you could be a great singer, and you could be a great actor. You're so good at that." And the mother will oftentimes be very supportive and spot the talent of the child and nurture that talent. And the dad will be more likely to say something like, "Oh, we'll support you to go for that talent." But if we're paying for a tutor and driving you to class and for gymnastics or whatever, that you can't become the best in your field, in a highly competitive field, unless you are willing to give up a good part of life, like seeing your friends a lot and going to parties and playing video games and just hanging out on the phone for hours. You can't do that. People who do that are not the ones that super succeed. And so the
Yeah.
mom often, so it comes to party time, and the daughter is invited or the son is invited to a party, and says, "I want to go to that party." And dad is much more likely to say, you have to make a choice here. We're making a choice to spend my time working to support you, and if you and to take you here and there, and that's fine if you don't want to do this. But if you don't want, don't expect us to support you, and you only put a half-hearted effort into something that takes a full-hearted effort and takes trade-offs and sacrifices. And
dads are a bit stricter.
So a dad is more likely to do that style of parenting. As of course, sometimes this is reversed. But as with Venus Williams and Serena Williams and just dozens and dozens of other superstars, it's very frequently the dad that sort of makes very that says, if you want to do this, you've got to make these trade-offs, these sacrifices, and so on. And so the children are more likely to succeed that way. So boys who grow up without dads, or with minimal, or what I call dad-deprived boys, I discovered they're more likely to have challenges in more than 70 different areas of development. From suicide to depression to failing to dropping out of high school to dropping out of college. And the problem with that is that when a boy doesn't do well in high school and drops out of high school, there's a 20% likelihood of him being unemployed in his early 20s. And he's much more likely to go back and live with his parents. And when a guy
just to iterate there. So I'm sure a lot of people are asking. So this is a quote that you have, which is 6 times the suicide rates from boys to young men versus women that boys have when they grow up without a father. Yes. Why is it? Is it that it just affects boys way more than it affects young girls?
Good. The girls have a female role model to model themselves after when they have a single mother. The boys don't have a male role model. Girls are more likely to express their feelings and not have to worry about being thought of as, that's not very feminine, you just cried, type of thing, as opposed to big boys don't cry. And so when somebody expresses their feelings and vulnerabilities, as girls are more likely to do, and a mother is very likely to be receptive to that, the girl can express her feelings, be heard, be seen, whereas the boy more likely to repress his feelings to begin with, and then having no male role model to say, Mom, I'm masturbating a lot. What do you think? The guy doesn't feel, a guy doesn't feel very comfortable talking to his mom about that, the father is more likely to be tough love, having that conditional approval with the dad, and that gives the boy sort of like a discipline, and the boundary enforcement leads to discipline, leads to boys having postponed gratification, and the postponed gratification is the single biggest predictor of success or failure. And so the boy with the dad is more likely to have that. But here is the really crucial issue. The boy without the boundary enforcement, that has less postponed gratification, is more likely to not do well in school, to not do well in that discipline of basketball, acting, whatever his dream is. And so he's more likely to be on the verge of failing. But when he fails in school, it's not he's usually at more of a failure to launch without that dad involvement. And that then it doesn't just remain there. He begins to see that if he drops out of high school or college, that a female who's a college graduate, who, by the way, will soon be more than twice as likely to graduate from college as their male counterparts. Females will be more than twice as likely to graduate from college as their female counterparts. But the trick in that is that that girls who are college graduates are not very interested in dating dropouts. They're not very interested in looking in somebody's parents' basements for a guy. They're not very interested in looking in unemployment lines for a future father. And so these boys are not just sexually rejected, they're also relationship rejected. Even if the guy is really good looking like you are and tall and handsome and so on, the woman is sort of like, okay, I'll have sex with him. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, you're really a nice guy, really enjoy your company, but you're not you're not father material, and the
Okay.
woman, and he gets rejected.
Yeah. Attraction is definitely something I want to go into as well, and how that differs from a man versus woman.
Hmm.
Um, do you think, though, the inverse could also, not the inverse, but the other situation could also apply where if a young woman or if a young girl grew up without a mother, but she grew up with her dad, would the negative effects of that happen for a woman, for a young girl growing up into a young woman, as it would for a boy growing up without a dad, if a girl didn't grow up with a mother?
Yeah, from what we know, not as much.
Huh.
The girls are with their dads. They usually have more connection with girlfriends, and they can complain or express their fears to girlfriends to a much greater degree than guys can. And mothers usually figure out a way, short of the mother being dead and or having died or whatever. The girl doesn't usually feel abandoned by the mother. Usually mothers remain involved. Even if the father is the primary parent, mothers make a lot of effort to get there, and fathers are much less likely to badmouth mothers than mothers are to badmouth fathers, a 5-to-1 ratio based on
Oh,
reports from
wow.
the children. So the mother, so the girl looks at the mirror and she sees, half her mother and half her father, but she doesn't feel her mother's a loser. She doesn't feel she doesn't feel abandoned by her mother as much, and so she doesn't. Whereas if the boy in particular or girl looks in the mirror and the father's being badmouthed, she eventually feels and sees that, oh, my eyes are a lot like my dad's eyes, my hair is a lot like my dad's hair, and she recognizes on some level, that half of her genes are her dad's genes, and her dad is, her mom is saying that her dad is irresponsible, a liar, a narcissist, that type of thing. And she or he, both the boy and girl, start worrying about themselves being a narcissist or a liar or irresponsible. And so that starts haunting the child. And so the father, when by requiring the daughter and the son to do the types of discipline that lead to postponed gratification, that usually leads to the children being more successful in school, having more social, having more ability to make distinctions between what is being aggressive versus what is being assertive, and therefore the social skills that come from the discipline are more likely to lead to the daughter doing well in school and having the respective teachers, being part of the right group or the right clique, if you will, that makes
Yeah.
her somewhat secure and somewhat insecure at the same time.
No, that rings true. Women tend to be certainly more expressive. They have more supportive groups, I think, in their female counterparts. Whereas men, I think we have, well, even if you do have friends, you're not going to talk about these emotional things that you're having issues with. That, especially when you're a teenager and you're self-conscious, it's just not the first thing you talk about when you're with a group of your guy friends, right? So I totally understand that. What happens if you grew up with a stepdad, though? I'm curious to know what the distinction is. So if you have a
Yeah.
relationship with your dad, but it's not totally dadless, you have some form of a relationship. I'm speaking for myself. My parents divorced, and my relationship with my dad isn't great, but I still grew up with a dad. I still remember, good or bad, experiences of being with him up to maybe 13, 14, and then we kind of drifted apart.
Mhm.
And maybe this is similar to stepdads, where it's not a biological dad, but he kind of came into your life later, maybe in your teenage or
Mhm.
young adulthood. How
Mhm.
do those situations play out versus growing up completely without a dad?
Yes, the stepdad can be very helpful, but there's a lot of cautionaries about stepdad and mother involvement. Mothers often, if the stepfather plays a typical role, which is the tough love and conditional approval role, the mother often interprets that as the father not having that deep love for the child that the mother has, and therefore, and so if that leads to the boy or the girl crying, particularly if it leads to the girl crying, the mother feels that the stepfather is insensitive. And so,
Mm.
in the great majority, but not all the cases, with daughters, a stepmother tends to not allow the stepfather to be more than an advisor. Exceptions to that happen when the mother is extremely strict and the stepfather is very nurturing. I was a stepfather to a woman who was very much like a sergeant. And, and a couple of the children, the ones that were having the most problems, fell in love with me because I sort of listened to them and heard them. And my boundary enforcement was not as great with those children because she took care of boundary enforcement really well. But so the mother wasn't, the mother often turned to me to be, to connect with the children because she saw that I did that. But with the woman who eventually became my wife, she was much more, I was more the boundary enforcer, and she was sort of like, I'll do this for you, so you won't be stressed out, you won't be crying. And my attitude was more like, you'll be more secure in the long run if I ask you some questions that lead you to learning how to do it yourself rather than giving you the answer. And so we had that sort of tension between us. But because I was the stepfather, the most I could be for much of the relationship was an advisor, to talk with her at night about, what I thought would be best for the children. And then she would implement what she could, but her heart came first. And when a heart comes first, very frequently that's wonderful on one level, but it's very hard to, when your heart is forward, like many moms' hearts is. It's often hard for them to see the child suffer, and so the mother, whose heart comes first, often becomes an enabler in order to prevent the child from suffering, and doesn't want the child to sort of take responsibility for it. They didn't get their homework done by bedtime, so okay, I'll let you stay later. I'll let you stay up later. To do your homework, because after all, I don't want you to go into school and not have your homework done. Whereas dad is far more likely to say some version, and this is statistically true what I'm saying now, the dad is far more likely to say some version of, I told you when the bedtime was. If you didn't get your homework done before that time, then that you're going to have to take responsibility for going in without your homework. And the dad is thinking in the back of his mind, when the child realizes it can't manipulate me into a later stay up time to do homework, that she or he will eventually learn to take responsibility for doing their homework within the framework of the pre-bedtime time. Children who grow up with primarily moms are likely to have much earlier bedtimes. Children with dads later bedtimes, but the children actually get to bed earlier with the dads than they do with the moms because of that greater amount of boundary enforcement from the dads.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, this seems to be a confusing time for young boys, young men, and just men in general on what it means to be a man. There seems to be a very disparity of what it used to be from a traditional sense. And I think a lot of people are confused because of these different definitions that are existing. So I feel like you're one of the most fascinating people to have this conversation around. I come from I was born in Korea, but grew up in Canada. But I've seen this culture of K-pop, of these boy bands with makeup and wearing metrosexual clothing, and in Korea, and women being particularly attracted to that and that makes more men want to become the sensitive character and the kind of the more the feminine, sensitive appeal to it. And I personally don't have any opinions in terms of what, I mean, I think men, women, they should do whatever they want, but how do you think that affects how, society in whole, because of these kind of unclear definitions of how a man should act or what are the traditional things that they should fulfill in families and relationships?
Yes, absolutely. This is so fascinating because I'm talking to a lot of junior high school boys and girls, and the boys will sort of like hesitate to talk with me because they don't really want to say anything that is not proper to be said. then they'll see that I'm open to anything that they say, and they'll say, what they're hearing in school is that this is like a junior high school boy, and he'll say, I'm hearing that masculinity is toxic, that we have male privilege, that we males are part of the patriarchy, and the patriarchy was designed to make rules to benefit men at the expense of women, and that the future is female, and that that everything they do, if they speak up and if they don't express their feelings, it's because they're emotionally repressed and retarded. If they do express their feelings, it's they're mansplaining. If they take initiatives too quickly with a girl without asking for permission first as to whether they can hold their hand, it is literally they literally can be accused of sexual harassment by law in California if they're in college, and they ask a girl out on a date, and she says yes, and then they reach over to take the girl's hand before she says, without asking her first, may I take your hand, and she can potentially accuse him
Wow.
of
How do you
sexual
even prove that?
harassment. That's the law in California. It's also it's also going through the legislatures of 26 states in the United States. And so on the one hand, the boy is learning, don't do anything like even touch a girl's hand if without asking her first. And theoretically, this is in reverse, but I've never heard of a guy saying, suing a woman for touching his hand before she touches
Hey,
his.
listen, it's
It's
2022.
not exactly the way it works, right?
Yeah. It's rare, but we've
And
seen some crazy shit happen. So yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But so he's caught between that message, and then on the other hand, seeing that the guys who are most successful with women, they do initiate quickly. And if he sort of says to a woman, is it okay if I touch your hand? Would that be okay? And then, is it okay if I sort of kiss you on the cheek? Would that be okay? And the woman is thinking of him as some type of wimp. But on the other hand, so he's caught between being accused of being a wimp on the one hand and a sexual harasser on the other, and seeing that the guys that that really get the girls, so to speak, are not the ones that are playing the wimp game. They're playing the sexually assertive game, and so the messages are enormously confusing. Or
Yeah.
he sees that in fact there is toxic masculinity, that the mass shooters are almost all males, the prisoners are almost all males, and so he sees enough examples of toxicity, male toxicity, that seems to be like not an off-base type of thing. But then he's hearing about male privilege, but he hasn't. What I explain in the Boy Crisis book is that male toxicity does exist, but it doesn't come from male privilege. It comes from male sacrifice. So males developed every generation had its war, and in each generation's war, Uncle Sam or some version of Uncle Sam around the world said, "We need you." Like in the Ukraine, the law is that every male between the ages of 18 and 60 must remain in the Ukraine and contribute to the war effort. The females, no such rule, no obligation whatsoever, except the ones they choose to exert. And so in most cultures, including the United States, there's still the boys, when the war came, were given social bribes, like they would be called hero if they participated in that nation's war for that generation. And uncle, they'd have pictures of their uncle who was a Marine who died in the Marines on their cabinet, and people would speak as Uncle Joe was really a hero. And so the boy is 16 years old, and he's being criticized left and right by his parents or whatever, not getting approval in school, and he thinks, well, I can become a hero even if I die. I can do that. So, but to become that hero, he has to disconnect from his feelings. He's in boot camp, and the sergeant, let's say he's partially Jewish, and the sergeant says, makes some anti-Semitic comment, and he raises his hand and says, "Excuse me, Sergeant, sir, but that was an anti-Semitic comment. I'm sure you didn't know that, but I just wanted to let you know." And the sergeant would laugh in his face and say, "Oh, well, sweet little Jew boy, why don't you do 20 push-ups? Oh, that's not enough. You're still complaining about it? 30 push-ups." And then everybody else would laugh at him for being sensitive like that. So the boy developed an understanding that he needed to disconnect from his feelings to prepare himself for being disposable, because the war machine worked best when there were no squeaky wheels. And his complaining about being criticized made him a squeaky wheel. So keep your feelings to yourself. In fact, it's better if you don't even get in touch with your feelings, because why get in touch with feelings you can't express to begin with? It's dysfunctional. And he notices also that the girls are not falling in love with the privates and the pacifists. They're falling in love with the officers or the gentlemen. Or he sees movies where Lois Lane has no interest in the sensitive Clark Kent, but she's suddenly very interested in him, the exact same human being, when she learns that Clark Kent has become Superman. And so there's all these tensions.
Yeah, I want to go deeper into that. So you have a question in one of your book outlines, which is a question around that men have about women, which is, why do women say they like to hear my feelings, but then withdraw when they hear my feelings?
Yes.
Which is kind of this, again, counterintuitive thing that, a lot of people tell you, but then obviously when it does happen, the reverse happens. So how much does attraction, do you think, plays a role in what a man should be defined as? So for example, do you think, because if you're looking at evolutionary biology, I guess one could argue that because back in the tribes days, men were the protectors physically from other tribes or other things that could potentially harm the families and the women and the children. They were the physical protectors and also the providers in terms of food, hunting, and all that stuff. And I guess one could argue that this is why women like men that have some sort of financial security, because that's kind of the currency that we have in terms of security and providing all that stuff, and also why they might like more the bad boys. So is that grounded on evolutionary biology in terms of how women are attracted to men? And is that something that men today are defined by, where they're following what women are attracted to, and they're playing that role to fit into the attraction, criteria of what women are looking for? Or is it, I guess what I'm asking is it the chicken or the egg, really? Is it the women that are attracted to men just strictly based on evolutionary biology, or is it men playing in the roles of what women are attracted to?
Well, it's both, meaning that, and they really aren't contradictory to each other. The evolutionarily, from insects on through humans, the female always wanted to mate, with a couple of exceptions in this scenario, but the great majority of animals, from insects to humans, the female sought out the male who was the alpha male, and and that male. So, for example, among buck elks, the female will seek the male that has the biggest rack, the biggest antlers, and so when she finds that male, she will express the desire to mate with him. But what's not realized is that in order to get the biggest rack or the biggest antlers, the one with that size of a rack exhausts 30% of the nutrients in his body, the calcium and the minerals. And so, and if he doesn't get rid of that rack immediately after reproducing, he's likely to die if the winter sets in and he hasn't replenished the minerals, the calcium, and the nutrients. And so the appearance of strength is actually his weakness, because he's the one most vulnerable to die if he doesn't get rid of that rack immediately.
And does the same, you think, apply transfers to humans? Do you think men suffer in reality trying to appease what women look for in the alpha male?
Men are constantly striving to be the reproductive choice of women, and in order to be the reproductive choice of women, we do pretty much anything that they are requiring of us. The challenge for men and men have always been willing to do that. So, they became the officer and the gentleman rather than the private and the pacifist. Almost every male in the Ukraine agrees to stay in the Ukraine and fight. And if he happens to survive, then he's a hero. But if he doesn't, oftentimes what happens for the men is the process of becoming that hero creates problems like PTSD. And so oftentimes he'll come back from war, and the woman will say he's not the man that he was when he left, because he now wakes up at night fearful of the slightest noise. He's treating me and the family like we're members of a military group rather than in a caring, nurturing, loving type of way. And so there's all these types of problems that are happening.
Yeah. So the difference between before, where I'd be curious to know what are the major factors you think that have led to more divorces as well. Is it, I guess religion could be one of them, and independence of women and them delaying their, having babies and all that stuff. Is there like a combination of all of these things that have led to more divorces?
Yes, and so number one, women have much more income than they used to have, so they're not dependent upon. There's given much more social permission to work, to be their own economic support, so that they can do two things. One is that they can divorce more easily, and that's a good thing on the one hand, because it gives women choice. They're not just feeling that they have to be prostitutes their whole life, and they marry a man for a source of income only. However, we haven't learned the communication skills that are necessary for men to share their feelings with a woman, as opposed to being able to just sort of like feel that they have to do what the woman wants to please her, and then they're keeping all these feelings to themselves until sometimes they blow up into a volcano, and he becomes emotionally abusive or maybe physically abusive, and then the woman is really scared because that's the opposite of the protector that she was had an instinct to marry. And so, and then the whole thing falls apart. And her girlfriends say to her, don't, if a man abuses you like that, even if he shouts at you like that, or, whatever, even if it isn't physical, and she's likely, many people don't know this, but females in relationships are as likely to be violent to the men as the men are to the women. But it's very rare for the male to call the police and say, my smaller wife is hitting me, please help. That's just not male style.
Yeah.
We only discovered that this equality of domestic violence is something that exists as a result of surveyors surveying both men and women and asking them, did you ever hit your husband? Did your husband ever hit you? Did he ever, hit you with, did you ever hit him, or vice versa, with a pan or a pot or an object while sleeping or whatever? And even the women acknowledge that they're far more likely, as likely to hit the man as but usually with a pot or a pan or an object rather than a fist, and often while sleeping as opposed to while awake. And so,
well, we also saw this in the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial.
Yes, and most people think of that as a bit of an exception, but the data, when the data on this came out in the 1970s by Strauss and Gelles, many feminists said that's ridiculous, it's not possible. And to feminists' credit, a lot of them did surveys of women, to prove Strauss and Gelles wrong. And they almost to a person found that Strauss and Gelles were quite correct, except what they hadn't covered was two things. One was they had not covered high school kids. And high school kids, girls are much more likely to hit their boyfriends than boys are to hit their girlfriends.
Why is that?
And then, what's that?
Why is that?
Because they just feel that there's more permission for it. Once a couple gets married, most girls figure that if they slap their boyfriend or they punch him, that'll just, he'll respond by, just sort of like, wow, that was really heavy duty. You didn't really have to do that. But he'll just, take it and move on. And particularly in today's atmosphere where domestic violence is almost always seen as from male to female, even though that's not accurate. The guy will usually just not complain, not do anything about it. And as a result, invite the possibility of it happening more when the girl or young woman does not feel understood. And both sexes leave each other feeling not understood.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine the domestic violence would lean towards heavier on the men doing it to the women. One, because of just the physical nature of it. And it just seems to be, from an evidence perspective, that is what is being more reported, particularly like in places like Mexico or a lot of these other I guess, non-Western spots where there's more of this machismo culture. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a lot of cases around that, but it is also true that if women were to hit a man, the likelihood of a man reporting something like that to the police, especially in a machismo culture where it is all about status and manliness, it just would not be the case. So this idea of like, the higher divorce rates, I guess, is just kind of going back to full circle, is certainly the independence of women, which are all great things. Technology, the ability to freeze eggs, downfall of religion. I guess I could also see where maybe religion did keep couples together, and it wasn't such a nowadays with most people being far more people being more agnostic and so forth. I could see like communities being a big one as well. Like before, maybe we lived in more tight-knit communities, but now with online and people living in more urban cities, traveling everywhere, working remotely, it's less of this tight-knit small community groups where you would run into someone if you were to get a divorce. So with all of that said, is marriage good for society if marriage was to continue at let's say at an increasing pace?
Yes.
The
brief answer is if we care about our children, marriage is very good for people who have children. The whole dynamic of human beings changes when we have children. So, for example, we often say that men earn more than women. That's not true. What's true is that fathers earn more than mothers. When we have children, the fathers are far more likely to give up jobs they love and take jobs that they don't care for, like instead of teaching and they may love teaching in junior high school or elementary school, but can't make enough money doing it, so they give up doing what they love to do, their passion, being a musician, an actor, an artist, all of which are high fulfillment jobs that you don't usually make much money at. And so men are likely to give up those types of things to be able to make money and to earn enough for the family. But so marriage, but the important thing about marriage is that it's a stabilizing factor. And so you don't need to have a stabilizing factor. It's totally your choice as to whether you have a stabilizing factor if you're not having children, because nobody is hurt if you stay together or separate. But once you have children, children really do much better when they have what I would call, the ideal is checks and balance parenting, with an equal amount of both mother and father involvement, or approximately. Now, the father may take a different role, be more likely to earn money and be less likely to be at home, but the children have the stability of knowing that father is going to come home and that the mom and dad are together. And what they don't know is that they usually have some type of dad style parenting and mom style parenting both happening in their life. And that turns out to be extremely helpful for not only boy children, but also for girl children. Girl children, for example, that don't have a significant father involvement, are far more likely to become pregnant out of wedlock as teenagers. And one of the reasons is, if we think about that, is that the girl child that doesn't have a lot of father involvement doesn't have a lot of nuance as to how to behave with a male, doesn't have a lot of male comfort. The only thing she knows for sure is that she can, that the one way she can keep that male from going off with another girl is to be sexual with him. So she's less likely to check into herself and saying, is this the type of male I want to be sexual with? Am I really ready to be sexual? And just be sexual in order to keep him. Or conversely, she's so unschooled in the nuances of interaction with a male that she's afraid to get into a relationship to begin with. So she tends to skew on both sides of the scale, either get involved sexually too quickly or be fearful of getting involved at all. And both give her different types of penalties that she pays, or sort of sad outcomes for her without having that father involvement. And so fathers that roughhouse with their kids, that tease their kids, mothers often think of teasing as being sort of a little bit cruel, especially if the child cries. But there's a positive and negative function of teasing, and for the mother and father to work out when is teasing too much, and when is it healthy for the child, is something that I thought that should be available in parenting books, but I ended up putting it in the Boy Crisis book because it didn't exist anywhere. So fathers didn't tell moms, I want to roughhouse with the kids, because the roughhousing done in the way that a good dad does it creates boundary enforcement, creates postponed gratification, and roughhousing leads to children being more empathetic. And most people would think of roughhousing and empathy. How could they possibly be connected? But they are. When dad says, if you are too rough with your brother or your sister, we'll stop the roughhousing. And then dad does stop the roughhousing when the brother or sister is too rough with a sibling. Then that forces the child to not be too rough with their sibling in order to get what they want, more roughhousing. And so that's just an example of some of the positive outcomes of things that are male style parenting, that dads, we can't blame moms for not knowing that, because moms don't know what dads don't say. And conversely, we can't blame dads for not knowing that, because I had never read in a parenting magazine or a parenting book of the positive outcomes of roughhousing, the positive outcomes of a certain amount of teasing, the positive outcomes of allowing your children to climb the tree. And very few dads say, when a child climbs the tree in the backyard and it's a little bit risky, that will increase the child's IQ and increase the child's ability to assess between what's dangerous and what's not dangerous. And of course, climbing the tree too high could also lead to the child falling and getting a concussion. And so one of the values of checks and balance parenting is that mom says, I don't want the child to climb the tree. Dad says, you're overprotecting the child. And they might work out a deal where you can climb the tree, but not too much, not too high, and not on these branches. And dad, you need to be out under the tree in case the child does fall, so the child doesn't get a concussion. And by the way, give me your cell phone so you don't get distracted, and you can focus just completely on our daughter or our son climbing that tree. And so that type of compromise.
This is also the problem with like ninth place trophies that are being celebrated in high schools or elementary schools. It doesn't really teach, like, a lot of the things that you mentioned. What the common framework is that you learn how to lose. You learn what real life is like, and that whether that's physical injuries, whether that is emotional pain, whether that is losing at something and then learning the lessons from that, and then taking that into other aspects of your life and improving, and then
Mm-hmm.
seeing the results of that. I mean, those are all things that are going to happen in real life. I mean, there's this famous quote. I think it was it's a quote. It's called I'm going to paraphrase it, which is, "It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war," meaning
Yeah.
that you can become, as Jordan Peterson said, a monster. You should be somewhat of the ability to be a monster, but you should learn how to control it. You should learn how to be able to use that as a tool in life. And I think it's kind of the downfall. So I guess for a question for you is, for people that are in these situations, maybe they grew up without a dad, or their parents that are now trying to raise their young boys without, maybe they're divorced. Like what are we to do in society? What are we supposed to provide as lessons so that these boys that are in these situations can become the role model males or the men that we want in society?
Very good question. A number of things. First, if there, let's say now a single mom's listening to this, and the most important single thing that you can do is to understand dad style parenting, so that you can let the father know that you now understand the positive value of the things that he is more likely to do that you might otherwise think are sort of not attentive to the child's underlying sensitivities. Like, why is it that you are opposed to giving the child the trophy for trying? Um, and and then also, why did you tease our son or daughter to the point where they cried? That was so insensitive of you. But to not understand. So the first thing a mom can do is to understand the value of dad style parenting, and then communicate that you now understand that to the father, and let the father know that you need him to be part of the process of raising the child. Because when men are needed, like in war, men are willing to die in exchange for being told that they served well, that they were needed, and they were wanted. So that's ideal number one. If for some reason the father is in prison for life, or is dead, or and maybe he's an alcoholic, by the way, and alcohol, if he's a hopeless alcoholic, that's one thing. But if he's an alcoholic, one of the reasons may be that he doesn't feel needed and he doesn't have purpose. And oftentimes somebody who feels needed and has purpose is less likely to be an alcoholic. So really explore trying to understand and to communicate with the biological dad how much he's needed. But if for some reason you can't get a hold of the biological dad, there's a lot of other things that can not be as good, but close to as good. One is getting the child involved in multiple sports, what I call in the boy crisis, the liberal arts of sports, team sports, pickup team sports. Really study the value of pickup team sports, sports that you have to train yourself to be part of a team, but it's largely self-training, like gymnastics or tennis, where the training is largely of your own skill sets more than the team. All of those have positive values. And then identify, spend time being at the sports practice with your son, and find, or your daughter, and find a male coach who you can talk to and say, my son doesn't have a dad. It would really be, or dad significantly involved dad. It would really be a help for you to just take him aside once in a while and just say something to him about what he's doing really well, why he is special, or what he might want to change to be more special. And he could use your guidance. And so single out good male leaders. If you're at all faith-based in your orientation, get your son involved in a faith-based community. But make sure that you check out the minister, the priest, the rabbi, the imam, and encourage that minister, priest, rabbi, or imam to get your son involved in a group of a group of boys your son's age, and to encourage them to talk about their feelings and their fears, and to have that be confidential, because a boy who doesn't know, who has who's encouraged to express feelings, but to have those feelings expressed in confidence, begins to discover that all the insecurities he has are the same insecurities that every other boy in that group has. And so that he doesn't need to cover them up and pretend he's sort of something that he's not inside. And that really heals boys an enormous amount. Get the boys involved in Cub Scouts. Cub Scouts, there's a lot of hard data that I talk about in the Boy Crisis as to why Cub Scouts lead to boys doing well in character development. And I don't know a single parent that doesn't want their children to have a better character. Boy Scouts have deconstructed masculinity ideally, and what boys learn in Boy Scouts is not harmed by girls being able to be involved in Boy Scouts the way Boy Scouts have it set up at the present moment. And so there's a lot of things that I talk about in the Boy Crisis to how to involve a stepfather, so the stepfather has a real parenting equality as opposed to just being a parenting advisor. All of these things, how to do family dinner nights so family dinner nights don't become family dinner nightmares. There's enormous healing and emotional intelligence development in a well-run parenting family dinner night. In a poorly run family dinner night, the opposite can be the case. So those are just a few things.
Do you have any advice for young men that maybe are in their 20s that are still developing, but they're not boys, or people maybe even in their, approaching their 30s? What are your advice for them to become better men, given maybe, perhaps they grew up without the best dad in their lives, or maybe even without a dad role model?
Find another man, just one or two, that you feel you can talk to, and develop routine meetings with him, like every week, on either virtually or more ideally in person. And then get that man to recommend one or two other men that you could, young men like yourself, that you can meet with. Follow the rules in the Boy Crisis, and also follow the rules in the Boy Crisis as to how to conduct a male-only group. But remember two things in particular: the importance of confidentiality, and the importance of being able to encourage each other to share feelings, and the importance of frequency and bonding. Second, look at men that you think that you would ideally like to be like, that you wish were a great father, and ask them to mentor you. Tell them that you need that mentorship, that you don't have a lot of father involvement. If you do have a biological father, try to find him, reach out to him, ask him to be involved. Tell him you need him. Tell him that he's important to you. He may not be ideal. It's important to not have an ideal as a father. It gives you space to feel special about yourself. It gives you space to sort of define yourself. But the involvement of the father is really very important. Get yourself involved in sports. Get yourself involved in a faith-based community if you're at all oriented toward that. If you're not at all oriented toward that, get yourself involved in meditation and yoga and other types of spiritual activities. If you don't believe in God, just think of God as being the other half of your brain. That when people pray, they're praying to the other half of their brain from your perspective, and getting advice from that other half of your brain. So spend a lot of time going through the Boy Crisis and really studying things that you can do for yourself, because you will love your life, love yourself, be less likely to be depressed, be less likely to commit suicide, be much less likely to become addicted to video games or drugs or pornography. Getting yourself addicted to pornography or addicted to anything has a lot more detrimental power than you would imagine at first.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, as difficult it is to hear for young men, there isn't anyone that's going to save you. I think you're at that age where you're no longer being expected to be taken care of by your mom or your dad or peers around you. Everyone is really just, responsible for taking care of themselves. So you mentioned community, mentorship, spirituality, which is really just all around personal growth. So those are great advice. And sports. Yes. Yeah. Awesome, Dr. Warren Farrell. So obviously the Boy Crisis, that's the main book that we want to point towards. But you also have a lot of other books. So the way men are,
why men are the way they are.
Why men are where they are. What are some of the books that we should check out and point towards too?
I'd say the to start with the Boy Crisis and why men are the way they are. And if you're really up for a very challenging book that will The Myth of Male Power, but I would start, if you're a young man listening to this, definitely with the Boy Crisis, or if you're a father or a mom, start there. I'm doing a lot of work with couples communication now and have for the past 30 years. So if communication is an issue for you, either with your son or your father or mother or your male or same-sex partner, really go to my website, Warren at Warren, just warrenfarrell.com, FARRELL.com, and go to the couples communication page. And there's I've finally been able to take the couples communication course that I've been working on for 30 years and been able to do that on video, and it's very inexpensively priced. And that will probably have a more positive impact on your life than anything that you'll read, actually.
Awesome. We'll have all those links below. Dr. Warren Farrell, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Ciao.